Hi, welcome to Train Signal. Welcome back to our Advanced Services in Windows Server 2012 course. We're turning our attention to the interesting feature of read-only domain controllers. Active Directory has long prided itself on a feature called multi-master replication, which is to say that I can make a change on any of the several domain controllers that manage my domain, and the changes that I make then replicate to all the other domain controllers in that same domain. And that's really a nice step in the right direction. There was a time where you could only make a change on the one primary domain controller, and those changes then flowed outward from there. So it's really nice to be able to have that ability to make changes anywhere, including all the various far-flung places where our company may do business. We might have offices in a dozen cities. I don't have to make my change at headquarters and have it replicate out from there. I can make the change at my local office, which is probably where it's needed by the local employee who wants to get their account logged on to it. They need an update to their password or something of that sort. So what are read-only domain controllers for? Those are for the situation where physical security is a concern at the destination location for that domain controller. We may have a situation where we've got a few users in a remote location. We've got large corporate headquarters in New York City and a large subsidiary office in Dallas. But we've got 8 users in Louisville. And those people want to be able to get authenticated too. They want to have nice, fast authentication, kind of like the people in Dallas do. Because they log in, they've got 3 domain controllers in the data center. Well, the Louisville office doesn't have a data center. The Louisville office is this small rental space that we've got in on Main Street. And we run the significant concern there that what if the shop is broken into in the middle of the night and somebody steals the domain controller? And it wouldn't be all that hard because here we are on Main Street, this little Main Street location. There's this big plate glass window. This place used to be a butcher shop before we moved in, and this big plate glass window out front, people can look in and see our domain controller sitting there on the counter. Middle of the night, somebody smashes in, grabs the DC, and we've got a problem. That's the risk. The reason we would consider putting a DC there at all is for things like slow logins. Users in Louisville are complaining that they have to authenticate over this slow dial-up 56K connection that connects them to the Dallas office, when all the other users get nice fast logins because they've got local DCs in their local data center. Well, the Louisville office here, the local branch, doesn't have a domain controller in it, ordinarily, unless of course we insist that there must be, either for account logon speed reasons, or perhaps for application support reasons. It might well be that corporate IT has demanded that we install some particular application in every location that we have. And we look at the installation instructions for that piece of software, and it says that it must be installed on a domain controller. Well, now, I've got this small branch office with 8 employees in it. Do I really want to put a domain controller there? Well, corporate IT says we have to, because we've got to install this application. It has to be in every location. The application needs a DC. Therefore, this unsecured Class C rental space in the middle of nowhere needs a domain controller. So what do we do with that? Well, what we're going to do is roll out something called a read-only domain controller. The read-only domain controller is going to shield us from a couple of major risks associated with a DC being exposed like that. One is the smash and grab scenario. Somebody grabs the DC and runs off into the night with it. Now, why is that a concern? The reason that's a concern is that ordinary domain controllers hold a copy of everything that there is to know about Active Directory, which is not only a complete list of all of our user accounts, but also a cached copy of all of their passwords. Now, the good news is those passwords are in a scrambled state, they're what's called hashed passwords. But there are hacking techniques that would give a determined attacker the ability to eventually, over a period of time, learn which passwords went with those hashed scrambles. This is an attack that the security world knows as the rainbow tables attack. No, I didn't just make that up. So how do I defeat that? Well, the obvious solution to the vulnerability of having the ability to steal all the passwords out of my branch office here is to cache only the passwords of the users who work in that local office. If I can do that, and the bad guy smashes in, grabs the DC and hits the road with it, he'll find when he gets back to his evil lair, he's only got 8 accounts that he can attempt to compromise there. It'll be a fairly trivial process for me as a sysadmin to be able to reset the passwords for those accounts and notify the users that their passwords have been changed, that they need to log in and pick a new password. Meanwhile, the bad guy finds that after spending hours or days trying to hack passwords out of that DC, that the passwords that he's retrieved are no longer valid in the domain. They've been changed. The other risk that RODCs are intended to defend us against is the scenario where the bad guy breaks into the office and rather than stealing the DC and running out the door with it, instead tries to hack into the DC there and inject wrong, harmful, damaging information into that domain controller, because after all, domain controllers work in such a way that they replicate data amongst one another, right? So any changes on the DC should flow to all the other DCs and cripple the company. This is maybe a corporate espionage sort of a scenario. Well, once again, the RODC helps defend us against that, because read-only domain controllers, by definition, only read data from other writable DCs elsewhere in my domain. They don't ever replicate their data back to writable domain controllers in the domain. If you try to make a change on a read-only domain controller, that RODC says, ooh, no, you don't want to talk to me about that. Go talk to this domain controller and go to make your change over there. The RODC itself will never take a change directly. It will only replicate in changes from elsewhere. If somehow the bad guy manages to tamper with the local database to be able to make a unwanted change to the domain database, that change will only affect that local branch. It will not replicate back to corporate headquarters and from there over to our European subsidiary and from there over to Asia, and you get the idea. That would be potentially problematic. So RODCs defend us against both of those major concerns. To be able to roll one of these things out, we need to be able to install a Windows Server 2008 or later DC. This feature was added with the 2008 release. We need a domain that's running at the Windows Server 2003 domain functional level in a forest that's the Server 2003 forest functional level. We may want to consider the Server 2008 domain functional level if we have a particularly strong security focus. There are some security reasons why the 2008 level is even a notch more secure. We won't go into the gory details here, but long story short, we need a minimum of a Server 2003 forest functional level for this to work properly. So let's take a look at how to install a read-only domain controller. We have a couple of approaches available to us for installing an RODC, and it largely depends upon who is at our branch office in Louisville. Maybe I've got somebody who works there who is in IT. This person is a member of our IT staff, computer science graduate of MIT, sharp person, ready to handle whatever we throw at them IT-wise. But in a lot of cases, this is a small branch office in the middle of nowhere. This isn't the IT headquarters. This isn't necessarily in that area that has any of our IT staff. This is a small office of people who are the graphic design team. This is a small office of individuals who aren't necessarily techies, although some of them may have some degree of technical experience. So our options include doing a full installation of the domain controller as a DC by somebody who's a member of the domain admins group who's in Louisville. That's one option. A better option in many cases, and one that's more practical in as much as, again, a lot of our branch offices don't have IT staff locally, is to delegate installation of that new read-only domain controller to whoever the most technically savvy local user is who works in that office. So let's show you what that looks like. Step one in this process is to inform Active Directory that there will at some point be a new domain controller. Now, I could have the new RODC shipped to headquarters and then reship it back out to Louisville. But it would be more economical if I just have my vendor ship the PC right to Louisville and I do my homework ahead of time so that the network is ready to receive that computer when it arrives. So step one is to right-click my domain controller's OU and identify that I want to pre-create a read-only domain controller account. When I do, we're launching effectively the DC Promo tool, the domain controller installation wizard, so as to identify an individual who has the right to be able to create this account here. I'm currently logged in as the domain administrator. That will do. And then we identify the name of the RODC I want to create. Well, this is going to be Louisville server 4.globalmatrix.local. System's going to check DNS to make sure that that name is not currently in use in my organization. It wants to know what site it's part of. Well, I'll probably at some point want to double back and create a new site for Louisville. I haven't done that as of yet. In our GlobalMantics example, Louisville hasn't had a domain controller up to this point because they're a small office. But corporate IT now says we have to have a DC there. So that does mean that I'm going to need to put a site there. For the time being, I'll put it in Dallas, just because that's the nearest location network-wise to my Louisville location. They're connected over a slow link, but that's close enough for our purposes. We can patch that after the fact with the Active Directory Sites and Services tool. System validates that our DNS configuration is right. Now our wizard wants us to choose from a number of standard options when deploying a new domain controller. Is it also going to be a DNS server? Very, very common, of course, but not a requirement technically. Is it going to be a global catalog server? I get my choice of whether it's going to host an index of all important information in the forest. It is possible for an RODC to be a global catalog server. It's a little bit surprising, but it's true. And do I want it to be an RODC? Well, yes, of course. I wouldn't have started the RODC preparation wizard if I didn't intend for it to be an RODC. I cannot turn that option off. Clicking Next, it offers me a very interesting option. It gives me the ability, if I want to delegate the ability to complete the installation and to do ongoing maintenance of this particular server to somebody, some particular user, or in the real world, practically, some group of users. I can pick whoever the most IT savvy person is in that office and delegate to that person the permission to assist with the deployment of this domain controller and do certain kinds of ongoing maintenance. In this case, let me go find a user. In this particular case, Elaine Vargas works out of that office. So let me go drop her user account into this list. And we'll ask her if she'd be willing to assist with occasional maintenance tasks on that server. We're now ready to create the computer account. Let me click Next. There we go. That has completed. We've now got a LSV Server 4 account sitting here in my Domain Controllers OU. You'll note that at the moment, the system describes it as an unoccupied domain controller account. The account exists, but the system doesn't really know which computer really belongs to it. It is a read-only and global catalog-based account. Louisville Server 4. Note the little down arrow in the circle on the Louisville Server 4 account. That indicates the presence of a disabled account. Active Directory knows that there's no real computer dangling on the other end of that name, at least not as of yet, and therefore it's not going to allow any computer to authenticate using that computer account. So that's phase one. This is something that I'll do while the new server is in the process of being shipped to my new location, to Louisville in this case. So I get a phone call from Louisville. It's Elaine. She says, hey, the new DC you sent just showed up. Well, what should I do? And we talk her through the process of configuring an IP address, configuring a computer name. That computer name very clearly is going to be LSV-SVR4, the name of my pre-staged computer account for that domain controller. Now we get to the interesting part. How do I take that server and turn it into a DC? Let me flip over to server 4 and we'll take a look at what that looks like. So here I am on server 4. We want to start the process of deploying a domain controller in the read-only domain controller mode on this server. The starting point for that is always going to be installing the ADDS role and starting the Active Directory installation wizard. So let me go Add Roles and Features. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to do a role-based installation. We're not deploying a VDI here. Next step, which server am I deploying onto? I'm choosing server 4 from my server pool. The list of servers that I can affect from here at the moment includes this one. Next, I want to install ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. It offers me to install the additional administration tools for that server too. Sure, why not? My colleague Elaine may have need of that while she's administering that server from time to time. I'll click Next. It offers me features. I have no particular features I want to install, so I'll click Next again. It gives me some quick information about Active Directory. We're ready to confirm our installation and install the binaries. This part always takes a while. Hang on a second, I think I can help with this. There we go, all set. Our DC installation is completed, but we've not yet promoted it to become a domain controller. We've installed the binaries, but we haven't told it to be a DC. So that requires me to follow this link here, promote this server to a domain controller. The dcpromo.exe command line tool is used now principally just for scripted installations. If I've got a server on which I want to do an automated installation because it's the 12th domain controller of this sort that I've done this week, I might build an answer file that has the answers to the questions that are going to appear in that installation process and use that. My installation GUI has launched, but it's hiding from me. I'm going to go find it down here. So there's my wizard to configure my new domain controller, whose binaries I've installed, but for which I haven't configured the DC fully yet. I'm going to add my domain controller to an existing domain. Which one? Well, that's going to be GlobalMantics. Which user account am I going to use to perform this operation? Well, part of the magic of having a read-only domain controller is I can hand off that responsibility to Elaine Vargas, who's an employee who works in that location and is able to navigate the directions that I'm supplying to get this domain controller installed properly. Having identified that user account, I'm going to click Next. And note the interesting message that appears on the top of the screen. It says a pre-created RODC account that matches the name of this target server. It invites me to choose whether to use that existing RODC account or reinstall from scratch. And in this case, very clearly, the whole reason I'm doing this is to be able to reuse, which is to say to use, that existing RODC account that we built in the prior step. It sees the configuration details that came from that account. I'm not able to change those things. Which site is this associated with? It is reading Dallas correctly from that. I can't change that either. Again, that's coming directly from the writable domain controllers. Note that if I had chosen the option to reinstall, I would get to pick and choose all those various relevant options. But in the case of using the existing, Dallas is the option because I told it that when I created the account. We do need a DSRM password. We need an account password to be able to handle scenarios where I want to do offline defragmentation of my server, or I want to otherwise repair the Active Directory database, things of that sort. Because this is a so-called replica DC, it's a copy of existing writable domain controllers that are already in the domain, it is possible that I might install this by installing from media. It might be that somebody back at headquarters used the ntdsutil.exe utility to produce a CD that contains a copy of most of the content that's in the domain controller and shipped that to Louisville so that my installer can use that CD and install that domain controller directly using that media, replicating in only those changes that have occurred since the time that the backup was made. It's not technically a backup. You don't use the backup tool for it. You use ntdsutil, but it's somewhat like a backup in that sense. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and replicate data over the network from, and I get to pick which domain controller seems sensible. In this case, Dallas's server 2 is going to be the closest one to this location. I'm going to click Next. It wants to know where the AD database is going to go and the companion log files and sysvol folders. The default locations are fine in this case, but I could choose alternate locations if I had a specific performance need for that. I'm going to click Next, and we are prepared to create a new domain controller here. I'm going to click Next. That's going to kick off our installation as soon as I click Install. And there we go. We're rebooting server 4 because we've got our domain controller installed. Server 2012 does something a little bit new in as much as it triggers an automatic reboot when you've installed or removed a domain controller service from a particular computer. So now let's jump back over to server 1 and see how the domain has responded to the presence of this new DC. So here I am on server 1. We want to validate that our configuration of this new read-only domain controller has been taken up properly by the domain. So let me go ahead and refresh my domain controllers collection. We can see that the information about Louisville Server 4 has been updated to reflect the presence of a read-only global catalog server. If I pull up the properties of that computer account, I can see that it thinks of it as a GC running the Server 2012 operating system. This looks good. There's an additional couple of configuration areas here in our computer account for this server that deserves our attention, that I want to draw your attention to. And the one that I want to focus on is this one here labeled Password Replication Policy. Let me jump to my slides for a second and let's discuss what this is intended to accomplish. You'll recall that our read-only domain controller is designed to hold a read-only copy of the data that it does store, and then to also ensure that we're not storing a needless quantity of passwords for user accounts that live in the domain. Because again, this domain controller is only going to be fielding authentications probably for the 4, 5, half a dozen, 12 people, whatever, that work in this local office in Louisville. I don't need to store the passwords of thousands or tens of thousands of users on that computer. That makes it more vulnerable. What I'd rather do is just store the passwords of the people who work locally in that office. So whereas the passwords get replicated among all the other writable DCs in my organization, my RODC can be configured differently to be able to carefully allow only certain user accounts to have their information cached locally on that DC. So let's see how that's accomplished. So here in the Password Replication Policy tab, back over here on Server 1, we're able to describe who can and cannot have their passwords cached locally on this DC. Now you'll note that of a long list of trusted friends, administrators, account operators, backup operators, server operators, the one group that's being allowed to have their passwords cached is this group, the allowed RODC Password Replication Group. This group exists in Active Directory in everything Windows Server 2008 and later. The architecture allows me to add some list of groups who I know should be allowed to have their passwords cached here in Louisville, and some list of people who I specifically want to prevent. And note that administrators are in that list. Administrators by default are denied the ability to have their passwords cached on this server, and with obvious good reason. If this server is vulnerable to somebody smashing in through the window and grabbing the DC and running with it, the very last passwords I want cached on that DC and vulnerable to attack is the administrator accounts for my domain. So anybody in that group gets denied. I could add additional groups to allow or to deny, but for our purposes it's sufficient to simply add the individuals who we intend to have their passwords cached to the allowed list. So let me jump over to the users container and we'll configure that allowed RODC password group and identify some people who should be part of that collection. So there's my allowed RODC password replication group. I'm going to pull up its properties and configure its members list. Let's drop in some users. I've got a couple of users who work in that office. Our friend Elaine, of course, is an employee there. She's a administrator's helper. And we've got our friend Clayton Mallow. Clayton is a user there. There's his user account. Now here's the part that's going to surprise you a little bit. I not only need to cache the passwords for the user accounts on that domain controller if I want to be able to speed up their logins, and that's again one of the major reasons I'm putting the DC there in the first place. But the interesting surprise is that not only do I need their user accounts there, but I'm also going to need the computer accounts of the computers that they're logging onto. Lacking that information, the authentication process is still going to have to go across the WAN to get to a writable DC anyway for complex reasons of Kerberos ticket management. We won't go into the details on that today. But important to know that I do need to add the computer accounts for these users as well. So I'm going to configure my object types tool to identify that I also want to find computers in my searching, as well as users and groups and such. Let me go look for Elaine again. And there's Elaine's Windows 8 laptop. And I got a computer for Clayton. We've got a PC desktop for him. There's Clayton's Windows 8 PC. And we're good. I've added those individuals to the allowed RODC password replication group. And we know that the allowed RODC password replication group is configured in the replication password policy for Louisville Server 4 to be allowed to have their password cached. And that means that if any of these users logs in from Louisville, that request hits the local DC. The local DC initially doesn't have a cached copy of that user's password, forwards the authentication to Dallas, probably. User authenticates against a DC in Dallas, gets a response back from the Dallas server, says, yep, that's your password, you're good. and the local DC caches a copy of that password because that user is in the password policy replication list. If the domain administrator leaves the New York City office, flies to Louisville, logs onto a local PC in Louisville, that request goes to the local DC, gets redirected from there to Dallas. The Dallas DC says, yep, you're the domain admin, you're welcome to log in. The local DC does not cache that user's password because they're in the administrator's list. They're explicitly denied the ability to do that. And beyond that, they're not in the allowed list. In the case of a user who's both in an allowed group and a denied group, perhaps unsurprisingly, the deny wins. If there's a good reason for you to be denied the ability to have your password cached, that's what's going to happen. One other important idea I want to address is the idea of local administration of that server. We've now deployed a domain controller in Louisville that's at some distant remove from corporate headquarters. The nearest IT staff person may be hundreds of miles away. What do I do if I need to reboot this server? What do I do if I need to install a new driver? What do I need to do if I need to restart a service for some reason? What I don't want to do is put a IT administrator on a plane, fly him 500 miles just to be able to go reboot a server. But can I log in just anybody into a DC? Well, in general, no. Domain controllers obey a rule where only domain admins are able to log in locally to domain controllers. And we're operating in a branch office. None of the people in the branch office are going to be domain admins, almost certainly. So now what do? Well, it turns out the same feature that enabled Elaine to complete the DC promo effort for this server also gives her the ability to do local administration on that box. Let me jump back to the server environment and let me illustrate that. So back here on server 1, I'm going to come down to this tab labeled Managed By, and there's our good friend Elaine. This is the same name that I supplied when I did the initial pre-creation of the RODC account. And it does say the selected group, in this case user, but groups are for obvious reasons technically preferred, does have the ability to do local administration of that server. Elaine can log on locally, Clayton cannot. I could pick a different user if I want to be able to hand off that responsibility to some other user or indeed to some group of users. I can do so. The nice thing about this feature is that I am giving this person domain controller administration ability just on that one server. If that person gets on a plane and flies to corporate headquarters and sits down in front of New York City server 1 and tries to log on locally, Elaine will get a message that says, you need to be a domain administrator to log into this domain controller. But she doesn't on the domain controller back in her home office. This is a very handy ability to be able to hand off local domain controller admin privileges to somebody without making them a domain admin, granting all the rights and privileges that come with being a domain administrator. I don't want Elaine in this example to be able to reconfigure sites and services to create a new site link between Louisville and our new office in Santa Clara, California. What I do want is for her to be able to log into that server and restart a service or update a driver. And this accomplishes that. There's a lot of neat functionality in the read-only domain controller feature. I'm glad to have had a chance to be able to share that with you, and I look forward to sharing more information about Windows administration in another lesson.